Hello, dear friends, and welcome to Warm Pages. I'm Edward, your host, and this is a brand new chapter for us on our brand new home. I'm so glad you're here with me. Tonight is our very first episode, the first of many, and I truly hope you'll enjoy it. Our promise to you is simple. With every story, we'll grow a little better, a little warmer, a little harder to put down. So, settle in, tuck yourself under the blanket, and let the fire do its work. Enjoy the story. Chapter 1. Mist lay along the elder hedge that morning, the way it always did in the last week of September, waiting for the sun to earn its keep before it thinned. Birdie stood at the open back door of Wren Cottage in her dressing gown, a full 20 minutes before she meant to be dressed, watching her breath and the mist do more or less the same slow, unhurried thing, and thought, not for the first time, that October announced itself to the garden a full week before it dared come near the calendar. The kettle was already singing by the time she'd pulled on the bottle green dress with the cream dots, her autumn dress, the only sensible choice once the elderberries turned, and buttoned the oatmeal cardigan over it. She wound Thomas's watch where it lived, pinned inside against her heart, 3 careful turns, the way she had every morning for more years than she now cared to count aloud. Then she carried her tea to the kitchen window as she always did, to take her orders for the day from whoever arrived at the sill first. It was Pip, of course. It was nearly always Pip. He came down onto the empty half of the bird table, with the particular self-importance of a robin who considers the garden to be run largely for his benefit, cocked one eye at her through the glass and waited. Yes, Birdie told him, buttering toast she had no great appetite for. I know what day it is. It was the day, every year, that she turned the herb bed over for winter, lifted what wanted lifting, cut back what wanted cutting, and had a stern, private word with the sage which sprawled. She took her second cup of tea out to the bench under the apple tree to drink it properly, in the cold, the way tea was meant to be drunk, and Marmalade came out after her at his own enormous leisure, and arranged his considerable ginger self across the third step of the bench as though he had personally selected the morning's weather and approved of it. The garden, this time of year, told her everything she needed to know about the summer just gone. The roses wanting one last deadheading before the frost came for the hips properly, the runner beans gone woody and philosophical on their canes, the herb bed a little tired and ready for its rest. She worked her way along it with the small shears from her cardigan pocket, snipping spent heads into the trug, and found, as she often did at this hour, that her hands did the thinking and left her mind free to wander wherever it pleased. This morning it pleased to wander nowhere at all, which was its own small luxury. She dead-headed the last of the Michaelmas daisies. She noted, with the mild, cataloguing attention she gave everything in that garden, that the time had come through better than she'd any right to expect, and that a jay had been at the hazel again, and that the geraniums by the gate would want bringing in before the week was out. Small things. The kind of things a garden simply tells you, if you are the sort of person who listens. She was on her knees by the herb bed, gently working the fork around the roots of the lovage, when Marmalade lifted his great head, not alarmed, only interested, the way he was interested in the postman, the vicar's bicycle bell, and very little else. And Pip left the trowel handle for the top of the wall, which was his particular way of announcing that someone was coming up the lane. It was only the second post. Birdie knew the sound of the gate by now the way she knew her own name, and got to her feet unhurried, brushing the soil from her knees, to find a single letter waiting in the box beside it. Her name written across the front in a hand she would have known blindfolded, large, looping, and entirely without patience for the smaller loops of a capital G Winnie. She carried it back to the bench, and Marmalade resettled himself against her skirt, with the air of a cat who fully intended to be read to. The paper, when she opened it, smelled faintly of salt and pipe smoke, the way everything that came out of Galeview always did. "Dearest Birdie, Come before the gales get here and cut us off for a fortnight, there's a dear. The forecast says end of the week, though the forecast has never once been right about anything in Saltcliffe in living memory. Bring your good umbrella and your patience for Mrs. Fitch at the Marine, who has started up the deck chair business again. I have the blue room made up, and Mrs. Furrow's already planning a pie in your honour. Say yes. W. Birdie read it twice, the second time more slowly than the first, and found she was smiling at nothing in particular, at Winnie's handwriting, or the pie, or the small familiar tug of the sea calling her the way it always did once a year or so, whether she had asked it to or not. She folded the letter along its own crease, and sat a moment longer with it in her lap, the garden settling back into its ordinary quiet around her. Pip returned to his trowel, Marmalade already half asleep, the last of the mist finally giving up and letting the sun through properly. "Well," she said to no one but the robin, "it seems we're wanted at the coast." She would write back after breakfast, she decided, and see about a ticket for the end of the week. Before the gales, if Winnie's forecast could be trusted this once, and Birdie rather thought this once it might. Chapter 2. Millbridge came and went in its usual 20 minutes, market stalls being struck down early against the wind, and the guard who took Birdie's ticket at the junction, not Albert Punch this time, but a younger man with Albert's careful way of checking the sky before he checked his watch, remarked that they'd have her over the points at Saltcliffe a good half hour ahead of the weather, if the weather behaved itself even that long. Birdie thanked him, took her usual seat on the coast branch, window facing backwards, her thermos and her embroidery on her lap, though the embroidery went largely unstitched, and watched Wrenshire's green fields give way, mile by mile, to gorse and grey stone and at last to the flat pewter line of the sea. Saltcliffe met her the way it always did, gulls first, wheeling and complaining over the station roof, then the smell of salt and coal smoke together, then the long grey sweep of the front with its shuttered ice-cream kiosk and its faded Grand Marine Hotel standing at the end of it, like an old actress who still expected her entrance to be noticed. The wind here had a different manners to Elderfields. It didn't so much visit as insist, and it took Birdie's hat firmly in hand the moment she stepped down onto the platform. Winnie was waiting at the barrier, in a coat the colour of a robin's egg, waving with both arms as though Birdie might otherwise miss her, in a crowd of exactly no other people, and the two of them walked up from the station arm in arm, trading news the whole way. Winnie's mostly, delivered at a pace that left very little room for Birdie's. Galeview stood 3 streets back from the front, tall and narrow and salt-scoured, with a brass vacancies sign that Winnie kept polished purely out of habit, since she was, by her own cheerful admission, fully let for the fortnight. Inside it was all warmth after the wind, a fire already going in the front parlour, the smell of a pie in its early, promising stages somewhere back in the kitchen, and a man Birdie hadn't yet been introduced to who took her case from her hand so quietly and so quickly that she hardly felt the weight leave her fingers. "Silas," Winnie said, by way of the whole introduction, "does everything round here that wants doing, and half of what doesn't. You'll hardly notice him, and then you'll wonder how anything ever got done before he came." Silas ducked his head, said nothing beyond a low "Miss Hartley," and carried her case up the narrow stairs 2 at a time, for all he must have been nearing 60. There was a captain in the parlour, Captain Skerry, broad and weathered, who rose halfway out of his chair to greet her, and sank back into it with a grunt about his knees. A young couple by the window introduced as Mr. and Mrs. Fenner, who smiled and said very little, and sat rather closer together than married people who'd been married any length of time generally troubled to, and, at a small table of his own near the good lamp, a neat, grey, unremarkable man with a stack of old newspapers at his elbow, who looked up at Birdie with the mild, incurious politeness of a man who kept himself carefully to himself. "Mr. Crake," Winnie said. "Down from? Where was it, Mr. Crake?" "Here and there," said Mr. Crake pleasantly, and returned to his newspapers. The afternoon was still bright enough in the gaps between gusts for Winnie to insist on the garden before tea. "While it still is one," she said, with a glance at the sky that Birdie understood perfectly. It was a good garden for a seaside plot, sheltered along one wall by an old fig that had no business surviving this far north, and did so anyway out of pure stubbornness. And Winnie kept a small greenhouse at the bottom of it where she grew, among the tomatoes and the geraniums wintering over, a pot of foxglove for the cough cordial she made every autumn and swore by more than she swore by Dr. Fennel. "Somebody's had the shears in here early," Birdie said, more to herself than to Winnie, looking at the pot. "Cut back hard, well before its season, the leaves that remained still green and unwilling to have gone. You don't usually take it down till after the first frost." "Silas, I expect," said Winnie, already moving on to the tomatoes, which had failed her badly this year and deserved, in her opinion, a good deal more discussion than a foxglove pot ever could. "Tidy's everything, whether it's asked or not. Now, these tomatoes, Birdie, look at them, I ask you." Birdie looked at the tomatoes, agreed that they were a sorry showing and thought no more about the foxglove at all. Tea, when it came, was taken by the fire, and Winnie, between refilling Birdie's cup and complaining fondly about Mrs. Fitch and the deck chairs, fell into the small, comfortable litany of a woman recounting her week to a friend who'd missed it. The butcher's boy who'd dropped a whole tray of chops on the front step, the choir's decision to attempt a descant nobody could reach, Mrs. Furrow's poor knees in this weather, and, turning out a coat pocket she'd been meaning to mend all afternoon, half a dozen oddments laid out on her palm for Birdie's amusement. A button, a bus ticket, a peppermint gone soft, a folded and yellowed scrap of newspaper that had clearly been carried and refolded a good many times, a stub of pencil, and a key that fit no lock in the house that Winnie had ever found. "Heaven knows whose that is," Winnie said, of the newspaper, barely glancing at it before sweeping the whole small collection back into her apron pocket. "People do carry the strangest things about with them. Now, will you want the window open tonight, or shall I ask Silas to see to the latch? He's ever so good with latches." Birdie said the latch could stay as it was, and privately thought that the sea air, whatever else it did for the lungs, seemed already to be doing something rather pleasant for her appetite, and that she would ask Winnie, before the week was out and in a quieter moment than this one, whose coat that had been. Chapter 3. The wind had freshened by evening, not yet the gale Winnie's letter had promised, but rehearsing for it, testing the shutters and finding 2 of them wanting, so that Silas spent the last hour before dinner going quietly round the house with a screwdriver and a look of a man settling an old score with a stubborn hinge. Birdie watched him from the parlour window for a while, the way he moved from task to task without ever seeming to hurry, or ever seeming to finish being needed, and thought that a house like this must run on people like Silas, the way a garden ran on earthworms, entirely, and without anyone troubling to notice. Dinner at Gale View was taken all together at one long table, which Winnie considered the whole point of a boarding house, and would brook no argument on. There was a good thick soup to start, the colour of autumn itself, and then a joint that Mrs. Furrow had clearly been coaxing along all afternoon, and a suet pudding to follow that made Captain Skerry declare, as he apparently did every evening to judge by Winnie's fond weary look, that Mrs. Furrow was wasted on a boarding house, and ought by rights to be cooking for a duke. It was over the joint that the trouble started. Birdie noticed it only because she happened to be watching Mr. Crake, who had eaten with the same neat, economical politeness he did everything else, and who set down his knife and fork rather more precisely than the moment required, when Captain Skerry, 2 seats down, said something to him under his breath that did not stay under it for long. "And I'll thank you not to make me ask twice, Crake," the captain said, his voice climbing before he'd noticed it climbing. "A debt's a debt. I don't care how long we've known each other or haven't." "I've not forgotten what's owed," Crake said, mild as milk, not looking up from his plate. "I never forget what's owed to anyone. You might ask yourself whether that troubles you more than it ought." "Now then," Winnie said, in the particular bright voice she clearly kept in reserve for exactly this sort of evening, already rising to fetch the pudding a full minute before it was wanted. "Whatever it is, gentlemen, it can keep till the port, surely." The captain subsided, red about the ears, muttering something about a man's word meaning nothing these days. Craik returned to his dinner as though nothing at all had passed between them, and the table found its way, with visible relief, back to the safer waters of the weather and Mrs. Fitch's deck chairs. But Birdie, folding her napkin rather more slowly than the moment strictly required, turned the exchange over once or twice the way she'd have turned over a stone in the garden, curious what might be underneath it. A debt's a debt. An old debt by the sound of the captain's voice. Old enough that how long we've known each other had come into it. Small enough perhaps to embarrass a man who plainly hated being embarrassed about anything. Across the table the young Mrs. Fenner had gone very pink and very quiet, her hand finding her husband's under the cloth, and Birdie noted, without quite deciding it meant anything, that the pair of them had flinched at the raised voices rather harder than two people with nothing on their own conscience generally troubled to. After dinner, the men went through to the smoking room and the ladies stayed by the parlour fire, and it was there, over her coffee, that Birdie first properly met the Fenners' trunk, or rather heard of it, since the thing itself never left their room. Mrs. Fenner mentioned it only in passing, and only to explain why she couldn't come down to help Winnie with the mending basket just now. "Tom's just bringing the last of our things up. There's rather more of it than we meant to travel with," and coloured again, unnecessarily. Over a sentence that asked for no colouring at all, Birdie let it pass without comment. Young married people carried odd freight sometimes, and it was no business of a visiting spinster's what filled another woman's trunk. Silas came through once, briefly, to see to the fire before it wanted seeing to, added a log without being asked, and was gone again before Winnie had properly thanked him, which she did anyway to the closing door. "He'll wear himself thin, that man," Winnie said, comfortably pouring more coffee. "Been the same 11 years. I don't believe he's had a proper day off in all that time. Wouldn't know what to do with one if I gave it to him." "Doesn't he ever want one?" Birdie asked, mostly to be polite. "Silas, bless you no, says the house wants looking after more than he wants looking after himself, and I've long since stopped arguing the point." Winnie glanced towards the window where the wind had found something loose to rattle. "It's a comfort, mind, on a night like tonight's shaping up to be. I shouldn't like to be managing these shutters without him." Birdie agreed that it was, and meant it, and thought no more of Silas that evening than she thought of the fire irons, or the good sound bolts on the front door, necessary, reliable, entirely unremarkable, and went up to the blue room not long after, past a hall grate that Mrs. Furrow had not yet swept, where something pale had caught and half burned among the ash, and which Birdie noticed only enough to think, vaguely, that someone had been writing letters they hadn't cared to finish, before she went on up to bed and left it, like the wind outside, to settle itself by morning. Chapter 4. The wind woke Birdie before the gulls did, worrying at the shutter Silas had mended only the evening before, and by the time she came down to breakfast, the wireless in the kitchen was already predicting, in the calm official voice reserved for such things, "Fresh to strong winds, increasing later, with gales expected along the coast by tomorrow night." Winnie received this news the way she received most news, cheerfully and at volume, and set about the day's business of making the house ready for a fortnight's worth of weather in the space of one afternoon. Birdie made herself useful where she could, which chiefly meant staying out of the way, and spent a good part of the morning in the small back sitting room with Mrs. Furrow, turning the heel of a stocking while Mrs. Furrow saw to the mending basket and talked, in a low, steady, faintly worried voice, about the price of wool and the price of coal, and how far a housekeeping shilling didn't stretch these days, not with a sister in Rookchester poorly and needing sending to. She caught herself part way through that last remark, coloured, and changed the subject rather too quickly to the weather, and Birdie let her, the way one lets a stitch drop that isn't worth chasing. Captain Skerry came through once, restless, asked whether the post had been yet, was told it hadn't, and went out again with his coat collar up, muttering something about needing the air. Birdie watched him go past the window a few minutes later, head down against the wind, in the general direction of the postbox at the corner, and thought nothing more of it than that a man with a letter to send generally went and sent it, whatever the weather thought about the matter. It was early in the afternoon, with the barometer in the hall having dropped a visible notch since breakfast, that a stranger came to the door, a small, brisk, sharply dressed man who introduced himself to Winnie as Mr. Elmer Gosling, down from Millbridge on a small matter of business, and asked, with the particular politeness of a man who expects to be shown straight in, whether Mr. Craik was receiving. Mr. Craik was, and the two of them disappeared into the smoking room for the better part of an hour, during which Birdie, settled in the parlour with her embroidery, close enough to the connecting door to hear voices without hearing words, noted only that Mr. Gosling's tone rose and fell rather more than a small matter of business generally required, and that when he came out again, hat already in hand, he had the particular brightness of a man either very pleased with himself or working hard to look it. "Charming fellow, your Mr. Craik," he told Winnie in the hall, buttoning his coat against the weather. "Knows the value of a thing which is rarer than you'd think in a cellar. We've come to terms on the clock. I'll send the boy for it Thursday, once the money's settled." "What clock's this, then?" Winnie asked, with the frank interest of a woman who liked to know everything happening under her own roof. "A little silver travelling clock, French movement. Rather a fine one. His grandfather's, he tells me, though I've heard that said of a good many clocks that never had a grandfather worth mentioning." Gosling laughed at his own joke rather more than it deserved, glanced once towards the smoking room door as though making sure it was properly shut, and let himself out into the wind with his hat held down against it. Birdie from the parlour had caught a glimpse of the thing in question through the half-open door before Gosling left. A small, handsome case, silver-backed, sitting on the side table by Mr. Craik's chair, its face turned so that she could just make out the hands, some 10 minutes fast of the clock in the hall. She thought idly that a man ought to correct a clock he meant to sell, and returned to her embroidery, and did not think of it again for the rest of that afternoon. By evening the wind had a real voice to it, rattling the fig tree against the garden wall and setting marmalade. Had he been there, which he wasn't, being some 55 minutes and a change at Millbridge away, minding his own garden without her, no doubt deeply unimpressed. Silas went round twice before dinner, checking every window catch in the house, unhurried and unbothered, the way he did everything, and Winnie declared over the soup that they were all of them very lucky to have him, gale or no gale. "Tomorrow night, the wireless says," she added, ladling with rather more force than the soup required. "Well, let it come. This house has stood worse than a bit of wind in its time, and so have I." Birdie, watching the lamp flame lean sideways in a draught that had no business finding its way indoors, thought that Winnie was very probably right about the house, and found herself, for no reason she could quite have named, less certain about everything else under its roof than she had been 3 days before. Chapter 5. By mid-afternoon the gulls had given up flying altogether, and stood about on the chimney-pots instead, backs to the wind, looking thoroughly unimpressed with the whole arrangement, and Winnie declared that any bird with sense enough to come in out of the weather like this had more sense than most of her guests, and sent Captain Skerry, who'd proposed a turn along the front to see it properly, back to his chair with a look that brooked no argument. The barometer in the hall had fallen further still by tea-time, and the light went early and strangely, the sky over the sea gone the colour of an old bruise. By 6 the rain had found its voice, and by 7 it had found the chimney, so that the parlour fire spat and sulked and had to be coaxed twice. And somewhere around 7:30, with no more warning than a long sigh through the whole house, the electric light gave out entirely, and Galeview went over to candles and lamps the way it must have done, Birdie thought, for most of its long life before the wires ever came. It was, in its way, rather lovely. The wind outside had real weight to it now, leaning on the windows, worrying at the tiles, and the sea beyond the front, unseen in the dark but unmistakably there, made a sound like something enormous turning over in its sleep. Inside, by contrast, the fire threw its light further without the electric lamps to compete with it, and the whole parlour gathered in close around it the way a house does when the weather outside has made a decision, and there's nothing left to do but agree with it. Silas moved through all of it, as though the storm was simply one more shutter that wanted his attention. He went from room to room with a lit lamp held high and steady, checking each window in turn, and when the fire threatened to go out entirely, he was down to the cellar and back with an armful of coal before Winnie had finished worrying aloud about it. "You'll want candles for upstairs before it's fully dark," he said to her, low, on his way through, and was gone again to fetch them. "I don't know what we'd do without that man on a night like this," Winnie said, watching him go to no one in particular, though the whole parlour heard her and murmured its agreement. "Only one with a key to the cellar besides me has done for years, ever since old Mr. Gale's time, and never once lost so much as a candle stub down there. I trust him with the greenhouse key too, come to that, and the till, and my own front door if it came to it." Captain Skerry, comfortable now with a glass at his elbow, said something to the effect that a man like that was worth 10 of your ordinary sort, and Mrs. Fenner, curled close against her husband on the small sofa, said it was ever so cosy really, once you stopped minding the noise, and even Mr. Craik settled in his usual chair with his usual stack of papers abandoned for once on his knee, allowed that he'd known worse nights at sea and been considerably less comfortable in them. It was Craik, in fact, who broke off partway through that remark to glance towards the side table and frown faintly, the way a man frowns at a small thing out of place. "My clock," he said. "I could have sworn I left it just there." "You'll have put it away yourself, safe from the damp," Winnie said, not looking up from her mending. "What with all this weather about? Things do walk off in a house full of people and half the lights out, Mr. Craik, and turn up again in the morning, none the worse." Craik allowed that she was probably right, said no more about it, and returned his attention to the fire, and the evening went on in its candlelit, companionable way. Cards got up at one end of the room, low talk at the other, the wind doing most of the talking outside, until well past 9, by which time nobody in that parlour could honestly have said, had anyone thought to ask them, exactly which of their number had been in the room at any particular quarter hour, and which had slipped out to see to a lamp or a fire or a shutter, and slipped back in again unremarked, the way people do on a night when the whole house is moving about by candlelight and nobody thinks to count. Mrs. Furrow brought Mr. Craik's usual hot nightcap up to him rather later than usual, the kitchen clock having stopped along with the electric light, and he thanked her for it pleasantly, and said he thought he'd take it up and turn in, the wind having quite worn him out with listening to it. The Fenners went up not long after, Mrs. Fenner's voice trailing back down the stairs in something that might have been a whispered word to her husband about the trunk, or might have been nothing at all. Birdie at the foot of the stairs with her own candle caught only the shape of it, and not the sense. She went up herself soon after, the storm still full-throated beyond the blue room's curtains, and lay for a while listening to it lean against the house, the way it had been leaning all evening, and thought, drowsily, without any particular alarm, that a wind with that much conviction in it must surely have started rather earlier than 8:30. Whatever the parlour clock, stopped now for the night, had seemed to agree on. Chapter 6. Morning came in pale and scoured, the storm having blown itself out somewhere in the small hours, and left the world looking faintly ashamed of the fuss it had made. Slates down off the Grand Marine's roof, a deck chair from Mrs. Fitch's disputed stretch of front wedged 3 streets away in someone's privet, and Winnie's fig tree stripped nearly bare but, as ever, still standing. The gulls were back on the chimney pots by 7, considerably more cheerful about the whole business than they'd been the evening before. It was Mrs. Furrow who went up with Mr. Craik's morning tray, as she always did, and Mrs. Furrow who came down again a good deal too quietly for a woman who'd gone up whistling, and asked, in a voice with no colour left in it at all, whether someone mightn't fetch the doctor. Birdie did not go up. There seemed, somehow, no need, and no kindness in it either. The house arranged itself instead around the quiet, careful business such mornings ask of a household. Winnie white-faced but steady, sending Silas for Dr. Fennel before he'd fully understood why he was being sent, the Fenners keeping to their room, Captain Skerry standing rather uselessly in the hall with his hands in his pockets and nowhere to put them. Dr. Fennel, when he came, was a slight, tired-eyed man who climbed the stairs like someone who had climbed a good many such stairs before and never once got easier about it. He was down again within the half-hour, and his verdict, delivered gently to Winnie in the hall, with Birdie near enough to hear it, was gentle too. His heart, I should think, Not a young man, and a night like that would try anyone, storm or no storm. The excitement of it, the noise. It happens. He paused then, turning his hat once in his hands, and added almost to himself, though it is a little odd, now you mention it, that he'd have taken his nightcap and never touched it. Cold as the room, and hardly a mouthful gone. A man with a poor heart generally wants the warmth of a thing more than most. Nobody quite knew what to say to that, and Dr. Fennel, seeming to hear how it had sounded aloud, said he was sure it meant nothing at all. Storms did strange things to a man's habits along with everything else, and went off to see about the certificate. The local sergeant arrived not long after, a broad, unhurried man called Fowler, who took down names and times in a notebook with the patient thoroughness of someone filling in a form he'd filled in 100 times before, and asked, mostly for form's sake, whether anyone had heard anything in the night. Nobody had, over that wind. Fowler said as much himself, cheerfully enough, remarking that the coastguard log had the first hard rain down as starting close on 7. Though you ask anyone in this town and they'll swear blind it was gone 8:30 before it properly broke. Always the way, once a wind gets going, nobody remembers it starting quiet. Birdie, standing near the window with her tea gone cold in her hand, turned that over once and set it aside, the way one sets aside any small fact that doesn't yet have anywhere to go. It was Silas, going up that afternoon to see about Mr. Crake's things for the sergeant, who found the drawer of the writing desk forced and the small dispatch case beside it sprung open and rifled through, its lock bent. He reported it at once, plainly troubled, and the household's quiet grief took on a new, harder edge. A burglar, then, in all that wind and dark, brazen enough to try a dead man's room while the house slept on around him. Winnie, distressed past her usual cheer, said she didn't like to think what else might have gone missing besides whatever the thief had wanted, and nobody, in the general unhappy bustle of it, thought again just then about a small silver travelling clock that had not been seen since the night before. Birdie took herself out to the garden in the last of the afternoon light, where the fig tree stood bare and patient against the wall, and a robin, not Pip, but near enough in manner to serve, came down to the empty half of a bird table Winnie kept stocked out of habit, and watched her with the same frank proprietary interest Pip always managed at home. Well, she told him, settling on the damp bench without much minding the damp, a man dies of a weak heart and leaves his nightcap cold beside him. A room gets searched the same night a whole houseful of people were meant to be together by the fire, only nobody can quite say who was where, or for how long, with the lamps out and everyone minding shutters instead of each other, and a wind that everyone remembers starting at 8:30 seems, by the coastguard's own book, to have started very much earlier than that. The robin cocked his head, unmoved, and went on with his hunting along the border. None of it means anything, of course, Birdie said, mostly to herself now, watching the light go grey and gold together over the wall. A cold cup, a stopped clock, a wind that started when it started. Small things generally don't, taken one at a time. She sat a while longer, until the cold drove even the robin off to somewhere warmer, and went in to find Winnie and ask gently whether she oughtn't write to Rookchester and see whether that record office of hers mightn't have anything on file about a Mr. Julius Crake. Purely, she said, so they'd know who to write to about the arrangement. Chapter 7. By the second morning after Mr. Crake's death, Saltcliffe had done what Saltcliffe always did with a sad thing that happened behind closed doors, turned it gently and inexorably into a story with a shape. The shape it had settled on, by the time Birdie walked down to the post office for stamps, was Captain Skerry's. She heard it twice before she had even reached the counter, once from a woman in a headscarf outside the greengrocer's, murmuring to a friend about words exchanged over money, mind, the very night before, and once from the postmistress herself, who lowered her voice to deliver it, as though lowering her voice made it any less thoroughly delivered. Nobody said outright that the captain had done anything. Nobody needed to. The quarrel at dinner had travelled the length of the town by now, gathering weight the way such things always did, until a raised voice over an old debt had become, somewhere between the butcher's and the church, very nearly a motive. Sergeant Fowler called at Gale View that afternoon, and it was Mrs. Furrow, turning out the hall grate properly for the first time since the storm, who found what he'd really come about. A scrap of paper, half burned but not wholly, the ash having caught only along one edge, so that a corner of it survived with a figure and a signature both still legible. A torn IOU, Captain Skerry's own hand on it, made out for a sum that would have troubled a much richer man than a retired sea captain living on his pension. Fowler took it away in an envelope with the careful, unhurried satisfaction of a man who felt, for the first time since the death, that he finally had something to hold. The captain himself said little about it, which did him no favours at all. He kept to his room more than he had, came down to meals grey and silent, and once, passing Birdie on the stairs, opened his mouth as though he meant to explain himself to her specifically, and then simply didn't, and went on down with his shoulders set the way a man's shoulders set when he has decided that nothing he says will be believed and has stopped trying. Birdie found Mrs. Fenner that same afternoon in the small sitting room, alone, with a needle idle in her hand and her eyes rather too bright, and sat herself down nearby with her own work without any particular ceremony about it. "You mustn't mind the captain's trouble weighing on you so," Birdie said, mild as anything, threading her needle. "It's no business of yours, whatever it turns out to be." "It isn't that," Mrs. Fenner said, and then, in the way people do when a kind voice finally asks nothing of them at all, told her the rest of it in a rush. That she and Tom weren't married, not properly, not yet. That they'd run from her father's house a fortnight before the banns could be called on a match he'd never have allowed. That the trunk held nothing more sinister than her mother's wedding dress, taken without asking, and that every whispered word anyone had overheard through their door had been about nothing worse than whether they dared write home before or after the ceremony. "We only wanted a proper start to it," Mrs. Fenner finished, twisting her handkerchief. "And now, with all this dreadfulness in the house, it feels a wicked thing even to be thinking about weddings at all." Birdie told her gently that a wedding was never a wicked thing to be thinking about, whatever else was happening around it, and that she happened to know a vicar in Elderfield who married people quietly and kindly, and asked no more questions than the law required. Should Saltcliffe's own churchwarden prove sticky about bans read from nowhere, and Mrs. Fenner cried a little, from relief more than anything, and thanked her, and went off to find her husband looking considerably lighter than she'd looked in 3 days. It was Silas that evening who Birdie noticed properly for what felt like the first time since the death, not because he'd done anything remarkable, but because of everything he had done without remark. It was Silas who'd gone for the undertaker, Silas who'd seen to the black-edged notices for the door and the small formal announcement for the Chronicle, Silas who'd carried Mr. Crake's few remaining effects down and packed them with a neatness that suggested he'd done such packing before. In 3 days of a houseful of grief and gossip and half-frightened speculation, Birdie realised, sitting by the fire that evening, she had never once heard Silas ask how Mr. Crake had died. Not the doctor, not Winnie, not the sergeant. Not so much as in passing over a tray of coal or a lamp being trimmed. Everyone else in the house had asked it a dozen times over, in a dozen different frightened or curious ways. Silas had simply gone about seeing to what wanted seeing to, as he always did, as though the question had never once occurred to him to want asking. It was, she told herself, watching him add a log to the fire with his usual quiet economy, exactly the kind of thing a busy, capable man might never think to ask, being far too occupied with the doing of things to trouble himself with the why of them. She thought it again, all the same, twice more before she went up to bed, the way one thinks of a stitch dropped somewhere back along a row, not troubling enough to unpick the whole thing for, but not quite forgotten either, and decided as she blew out her candle that she would ask Winnie tomorrow, in the most ordinary way in the world, exactly how long Silas had been with her before old Mr. Gale's time, and how he'd come to be there in the first place. Chapter 8. Sergeant Fowler came by the following afternoon looking like a man who had finally been permitted to close a file, and told Winnie in the hall, in the comfortable voice of someone delivering good news rather than sad, that the matter was very much as it appeared. A weak heart, the certificate signed and settled, and as for the room, well, a man in the captain's position, with debts of that size pressing on him, and a quarrel with the deceased not 2 nights before, wasn't hard to picture going up in the small hours looking for whatever ready money or sellable trifle might quiet his creditors a little longer. The silver clock hadn't turned up, which Fowler took as confirmation rather than mystery. He was sorry for it, he said, genuinely sorry, the captain having always struck him as a decent enough old fellow gone to seed on cards. But there it was. He'd be having a word with him in the morning, formal-like, and the coroner needn't trouble himself with anything more than the certificate already in hand. The house took the news the way a house takes any news that lets it stop holding its breath. Mrs. Furrow wept a little, from relief as much as sorrow, and said it was a mercy to have it settled, whatever poor Captain Skerry had come to. Winnie fussed over the tea things with rather more energy than the tea things required. Even the Fenners, wrapped up in their own quiet happiness now that Birdie's letter to the Elderfield vicarage was safely in the post, seemed to breathe easier for the household's sake. The captain himself took the news when it reached him, standing very still by the parlour window with his back to the room, and said nothing at all, which those who wanted the matter closed took for guilt, and which Birdie, watching the set of his shoulders, thought looked considerably more like a man who has stopped expecting to be believed and has given up the trouble of protesting. She found Dr. Fennell that same evening, called back to look in on Mrs. Furrow, whose nerves had been badly shaken by the whole business, and caught him afterward in the hall gathering his things in no particular hurry to be gone. "Winnie's forever telling me about her foxglove cordial," Birdie said, mild as the weather had finally turned, walking with him towards the door. "Swears by it for a winter chest more than she swears by you, Doctor, though I dare say you've heard that before. Is there truth in it, or is it only an old wives' tale dressed up in a bottle?" Dr. Fennell, who plainly enjoyed being asked a proper medical question after a week of grim and difficult ones, brightened at once. "Oh, there's truth in it. Right enough. Properly prepared, in the smallest doses. It's been used for a weak heart longer than either of us has been alive. Digitalis, we call it from the Latin. The trouble is the margin. A pinch too much, taken the wrong way, and the very thing that steadies a failing heart will stop a sound one just as neatly. Mimics the heart simply giving out very prettily, if you'll forgive the word for such an ugly business." He caught himself then, glancing at her with the faint embarrassment of a man who has strayed into shop talk at someone's front door. "Morbid stuff for a hall table, Miss Hartley. You must forgive me. A week like this one does put a man's thoughts in strange corners." "Not at all," Birdie said pleasantly. "I asked." He went, buttoning his coat against a wind that had, at last, forgotten how to be unkind, and Birdie stood a moment in the open doorway watching him down the path, turning the whole small exchange over the way she'd turn a stone she wasn't yet sure was worth picking up. A weak heart, a cold, untouched nightcap, a plant cut back hard and early in a greenhouse Winnie tended, and Silas alone held the key to. Well before its season wanted it cut at all. None of it, taken singly, was anything at all. A doctor's idle shop talk, a cordial recipe, a pot of foxglove trimmed too soon. She had spent a great many years of her life learning that the world was full of small true things that meant nothing whatsoever on their own, and she reminded herself of that now, quite firmly, the way she might remind a garden not to expect frost before its time. And yet... She closed the front door against the last of the evening chill and stood a moment in the hall, where the fire had been built up cheerfully now that the household had something settled to be cheerful about, and thought of Captain Skerry standing very still at the window, with his back to a room too relieved to look at him properly, and of a torn IOU that was real enough, and a debt that was real enough, and a search that had happened in a house full of moving lamps where nobody could quite say who had been where, and a clock that had never turned up in anyone's account of anything at all. "Well," she said, to nobody, winding Thomas's watch 3 careful turns before she went into supper, "it's a tidy enough story as stories go. I should like it a good deal better if it fit." Chapter 9. The wind had gone right out of the day by the time Birdie sat down to her embroidery that evening, and Gale View, 3 days quieter for its settled tragedy, had the particular hush of a house that has finished grieving out loud and gone back, cautiously, to grieving to itself. Winnie had nodded off in her chair by 9:30. The mending basket slid half off her lap, and the fire had burned down to the companionable, undemanding sort of glow that asks nothing of anyone but that they sit near it a while. Birdie had asked her, earlier that day, over the washing up, the question she'd set herself to ask: how long Silas had been with her, and how he'd come to be there in the first place. And Winnie had answered it the way she answered most things, generously and without a flicker of anything but fondness. "Oh, longer than I've had the place myself, near enough. He was here before Mr. Gale even, working for old Mrs. Trowett, who ran it before us. Came to her as a young man, 30 years back or more, not long after that dreadful business with the cormorant." She'd said it lightly, drying a plate, the way one repeats a story too old and too sad to still sting. Lost his dearest friend that same summer, out in a boat that had no business being out by all the old accounts, and Silas, the only one of the two of them, came back to tell of it. Never speaks of it, of course. Wouldn't expect him to. Some men carry a thing like that quiet their whole lives, and Silas is one of them if ever I met one. Birdie had said only that it was a very sad story, and asked whether the tea wanted freshening, and thought no more of it aloud for the rest of the day. But now, alone by the fire, with her needle moving through the linen in slow, even stitches that owed rather more to habit than attention, she let it come back to her properly, and set it down beside everything else she'd been carrying about all week, the way she'd have set out seed packets on the potting bench, one beside another, to see what pattern they made laid flat. A folded yellowed cutting, carried and refolded a good many times, about a boat lost in a gale, found, of all places, in Mr. Craik's own coat pocket, weeks before he ever came to Saltcliffe. A quarrel over an old debt, real enough and small enough, that had somehow grown in the telling into a motive large enough to hang a man's whole reputation on. A room searched in the small hours of a night when everyone in the house had been moving about by candlelight, and nobody could honestly account for anybody else. Searched thoroughly, and yet nothing taken from it that anyone could name, save a little silver clock that had gone missing rather earlier in the evening, for reasons that had nothing at all, she was increasingly certain, to do with the search itself. A pot of foxglove cut back hard weeks before its season, in a greenhouse to which precisely one person besides Winnie held a key. A wind that the whole household remembered breaking at 8:30, and a coastguard's log that had it breaking a good deal earlier, which meant that the hour everyone had so comfortably agreed they were all together, safe in each other's sight by the fire, was shorter, at both ends, than anybody had thought to question. And a man, capable, tireless, endlessly, unremarkably useful, who had never once, in 3 days of a house full of frightened, curious people asking the same question over and over, asked how Mr. Craik had died. Birdie's needle stilled somewhere in the middle of a stitch, and stayed still a good while, the firelight moving over her hands and not otherwise disturbed by anything in the room. It did not quite all fit. That was the trouble with it, and the true trouble with any pattern worth trusting. The shape was there, plain enough now that she'd laid the pieces out where she could see them all at once. But there remained one hairline gap in it she couldn't yet close. Not who, not really, not any longer, but the smaller, harder question of what a newspaper cutting about a boat lost 30 years ago could possibly have meant to a quiet, ordinary man who'd spent a lifetime since then simply being useful. A story needed its why as much as its who, and Birdie had never yet closed a case on the shape of a thing alone. She looked across at Winnie, still asleep, her mending still slipping gently from her lap, and did not wake her. "Tomorrow," Birdie said very quietly to the fire and to nobody else awake to hear it, "I think I should like to ask Mr. Petrel a little about the cormorant, and see what his face does when I do." She finished her row of stitches after that, folded her work away, and banked the fire for the night, and went up to bed with the whole shape of it laid out behind her eyes, waiting, patiently, the way all true things eventually did, for its last small piece to arrive and settle into place. Chapter 10. Birdie asked Winnie the next morning whether she might have everyone together for tea that afternoon. "Before I go home, there are 1 or 2 loose ends I should like tidied, and it's so much easier over a good pot of tea than in scattered corners of a house." And Winnie, who had learned over 50 years of friendship not to ask Birdie why when Birdie had that particular mild, unhurried look about her, simply said she'd see to it, and did. So it was that by 4 o'clock the parlour held, besides Birdie and Winnie, Captain Skerry looking braced for whatever was coming, the Fenners, hand in hand and considerably lighter than they'd been a week before, Mrs. Furrow hovering near the tea things out of habit more than duty, Sergeant Fowler seated quietly by the door at Birdie's particular request and asking no questions about it, and Mr. Elmer Gosling, who had come down from Millbridge that morning at Birdie's brief, courteous letter, and looked, from the moment he arrived, like a man who suspected exactly why he'd been asked. Birdie began, as she generally did, with the smallest and kindest of the loose ends. "Mr. Gosling," she said, pouring, "I think you have something of Mr. Craik's that wants returning, and I think you'd rather return it yourself than have Sergeant Fowler ask you for it." Gosling went the colour of the tea, and produced from his coat a small silver travelling clock, and confessed, in a rush that did him rather more credit than his crime had, that he'd taken it that first confused evening, meaning only to have it valued before another dealer got wind of it. A shabby, opportunist thing to do, he knew, and nothing more than that. Nobody in the room thought it was murder, least of all Birdie, and she told him so plainly, and watched the whole shape of him unclench with relief. "And you, Captain," Birdie said next, gentler still, "have carried something a good deal heavier than you needed to. The debt Mr. Craik pressed you for was old, and small, and entirely real, but it was never the whole of what was troubling you that night, was it? You went out after the quarrel not to do him harm, but to post a letter to your sister, asking for help you were too proud to ask anyone nearer, and you burned her answer in the grate rather than let this house see how far your pride had bent." The captain's face did something complicated, and he said, low, that he hadn't thought anyone would believe him if he told it plainer, and Birdie said that she believed him entirely, and that a man's shame over cards was no crime at all, whatever Wrenshire gossip liked to make of it. Only then did she turn, unhurried, towards the door, where Silas stood as he always stood, near enough to be useful, quiet enough to be forgotten, a fresh pot of hot water in his hands that nobody had thought to ask for and he had brought anyway. "It's not what's there, dear," Birdie said, to the room in general and to him in particular, setting down her cup. "It's what isn't. A nightcap gone cold, that a dying man's heart should have wanted warm. A pot of foxglove, cut back weeks before its season, in the one greenhouse in this town to which only one man held the key. A room searched by someone who took nothing worth taking, because what he came for wasn't silver at all. It was a torn scrap of newspaper, and whatever else Mr. Craik had gathered to go with it, about a boat called the Cormorant, and a night 30 years ago that only one of 2 young men came home from. The room had gone very still. Silas did not move, and did not for a long moment speak, and when he did his voice was as quiet and as steady as it had been every day of the 11 years Birdie had known him for. "I didn't push him under, Miss Hartley," he said. "I want that said plain, whatever else. The boat went over on its own, and I was the better swimmer, and I reached the shore and I let him. I let everyone believe it had gone the other way round. I've spent 30 years trying to be worth the difference." His hands at last were not quite steady on the pot. "Mr. Craik found the old inquest papers somehow, God knows how, and asked for money to leave it be. I hadn't the money, I hadn't anything except this house, and being useful in it, and I couldn't let him take that too." Nobody in the room spoke for the foxglove, or the nightcap, or the rest of it. It hardly seemed to want saying twice. Sergeant Fowler rose from his chair by the door gently, and Silas set down the pot of hot water with the same careful economy. He set down everything, and went with him without a word of protest, only pausing once at the door, to look back at Winnie with something that might have been an apology, and might have been simple grief for the life he'd just laid down. The parlour sat a long moment afterward in the particular hush that follows a true thing finally said aloud, the fire going on quietly as it always had, the tea going cold in everyone's cups without anyone much minding, until Winnie, at last, reached over and took Birdie's hand in both of hers and held it, and said nothing at all, because for once there was nothing that wanted saying better than that. Chapter 11. The morning she was to leave, a letter came for Gale View addressed in an unfamiliar careful hand to Mr. Julius Craik, forwarded on from an address in Rookchester, the original envelope crossed through and readdressed twice, as though it had been chasing him for longer than anyone could easily account for. Winnie turned it over in her hands at the breakfast table with a small sad frown, not liking to open a dead man's post and not quite knowing what else to do with it either. "No return address," she said. "Only this, your M, and nothing more. Who's to say who M might have been to him, or he to her, or whether it's even a her at all?" She set it on the mantelpiece rather than the fire, which Birdie thought said a good deal about Winnie without either of them needing to remark on it. "I'll keep it by, I think. Someone may come asking one day, or they may not. Either way, it doesn't feel a thing that wants burning." Birdie agreed that it didn't, and thought, folding her own things into her case a little later, that some threads were meant to stay loose a good while before anyone found the other end of them, and that this one, whatever it turned out to be, could wait very comfortably in a drawer at Gale View until it was ready to be found. The journey home was a gentler thing than the one out had been, the sea calm now, almost apologetic about the fuss it had lately made, and the branch line running to time all the way from Millbridge, so that Birdie had her usual seat, her thermos, and rather more embroidery finished by Elderfield Holt than she generally managed on a journey that short. The porter tipped his cap to her the way porters at that little station always did, and the lane up to Wren Cottage smelled, as it always did coming home in October, of wood smoke and wet leaves and something underneath both that was simply the smell of the place belonging to her. Marmalade was waiting at the garden gate, exactly where a cat who never followed her further always waited, and rose from his considerable haunches to greet her, with the dignified, unhurried air of one who had never once doubted she'd come back, whatever the sea had wanted to do about it. The cottage window was already catching the last gold of the afternoon by the time she let herself in, and the kettle, once she'd filled it, sang its old song at her exactly as it always had, as though nothing at all had happened in the week she'd been away. Pip came down onto the bird table before her tea had properly steeped, cocking his head with the particular self-importance of a robin who had clearly had a trying week managing the garden without her, and Birdie told him, settling onto the bench under the apple tree with her cup, that she was very sorry to have left him to it, and that a boarding-house robin, however obliging, was simply not the same. She spent the last hour of daylight in the herb bed, finishing what the week's absence had left undone, the lovage properly settled for winter, the last stubborn heads of Michaelmas daisy given their final trim, and found, working her way along the familiar rows, that her hands had gone back to their old, quiet business, as though they'd never left it, even while some other part of her mind stayed a good while longer at a boarding-house by the sea, turning over a torn scrap of newspaper and a pot of foxglove cut back too soon, and a man's voice saying quite steadily I didn't push him under. That evening by the fire she took up her needle at last and chose, from the small basket of silk she kept for such occasions, a length of grey-blue thread the exact colour of a sky before rain. She worked slowly as she always did on the first evening of a new motif, no more than the barest outline yet, a small upright shape, flame bent hard sideways, the wick still to come, and did not trouble herself to finish it that night, or to explain to anyone, had anyone been there to ask exactly what a storm lantern, leaning into the wind, was meant to mean. The sampler in the hallway would understand it in time, the way it understood everything else stitched into it before. Outside, as the light finally went, Vesper took up his evening post in the apple tree and sang the whole garden down to sleep the way he always did, note by note, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world and meant to use every minute of it. and Birdie, banking the fire, winding Thomas's watch its last 3 turns of the day, thought that whatever else the week had asked of her, it was very good indeed to be home before the frost came properly for the garden, and to have nothing more pressing before her now than a pot of tea, a waiting needle, and the ordinary unremarkable piece of an evening with nothing left in it to solve. Birdie told me this one, years later, on an evening not unlike that last one of hers at the cottage, and I confess I have never since been able to look at a storm lantern, in a picture or a window or anyone's hallway, without wondering just a little what it might be hiding.